We'll get started. All right, we're good? All right, welcome everybody to the Planning Commission meeting on November 29th. The first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. I have a motion.
So moved.
Moved by Dick,
Second.
seconded by Andrew. Any discussion? Seeing none? All right, all in favor in approving the agenda as listed? That was all ayes? All right. Good stuff. All right. Next item is approval of the minutes from the 15th. Motion to approve the minutes. Anyone?
I'll make the motion.
Moved by Dick,
Second.
seconded by Susanna. Any discussion on this? I did not have any comments this week.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Yeah, I was absent.
All good. All right. Well, if no discussion, then good job on the minutes. And all in favor of approving as listed? Aye.
On the minutes, I just want to say that Mary Ann will be doing the minutes again from the tape. She apologizes. I think she feels guilty. We say it's working okay.
Don't feel guilty, Marianne,
Yeah. Totally.
because you could accidentally be here till 11.
It's so riveting to watch the next day. I mean, come on.
Must see TV.
All right. So any disclosures relating to any potential conflicts of interest this evening?
No.
Seeing none. All right. Then open to the public. Any comments unrelated to anything on the agenda tonight? Breezing through. Okay. So the next item is zoning matters. We've got four different items. I'm going to try to keep these within time. We do have a little flexibility because we're a little ahead, but just be aware of that. The first topic is the Lake Champlain Transportation Company.
And if you would like, I'll transition to that.
Please.
I warned these guys that things would move along pretty quickly, but I didn't warn them that it would happen that quickly. We have Russell Fox and Chris Burke from Lake Champlain Transportation here.
Excellent. Good. How are you?
Hi.
And actually, is there anybody else that we should wait for, or are we just
Not for us, we're the only two from the very company.
okay?
Yeah, and I did just get an email from Pam apologizing regarding housing, but no one else I'm expecting to be here.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Let's.
But just before they start, recap a little bit. This issue was brought to your attention briefly at prior meetings. You were supplied with some background information for the last meeting and for this meeting. These folks have it. I have it on the computer and can project it. But what I expect that they will focus on, because that was the topic of interest, is what is it exactly that they're looking to do on the property, and what are some of the issues that are raised by the zoning regs that would make it difficult for them to do them without a change. But I guess without further ado, if you guys want to get started, and please use the mic.
Sure. My name is Russell Fox from the Lake Champlain Ferry Company. Basically, the ferry company has a work facility that's located out at Shelburne Shipyard. The shipyard is a dry dock facility that allows us to take the ferry boats out of the water and do the Coast Guard inspections, do the underwater related repairs necessary on a boat on a 5-year basis, but also on an annual basis, because we don't have time every 5 years to do all the work, so we try and break it up. Ferry companies kind of changed over time, and our vessels are getting older, and as we get older vessels, they require more and more maintenance, just like ourselves. And some of the changes that we found is that over time, we don't have enough space. We have a very, very small lot that, going back in the past, the ferry company used to own the entire shipyard, but the shipyard itself was sold, but retaining the dry dock facility itself in a very, very small footprint. Well, nobody knew at the time that zoning regulations were going to be what they are today. And as a result, the buildings are literally right on the edge of the property boundary. And because of some of the zoning regulations that prohibit expansion or changing footprints within the buffer zones of the edge of the property, we're restricted in our ability to change the size of the buildings. So what we're looking to do, we have two buildings that it affects. We have a work shed building, and we have a powerhouse structure building. So the building that's at the top is basically our workshop. So that workshop allows any of the working on shafts or propellers or steel work, cutting, fabrications that are necessary. And then the other building is the powerhouse building that's on your left, and that actually contains the winch structure itself. That's the electric motor through multiple gear reductions that allow the ferry boat to be pulled out.
The shop is also all of our storage space.
It is, yeah. So over time, Mary's been very generous with space, but times have changed, and we don't have access to storage space that we've had for many years with the reconstruction of a building that she did. So we really find ourselves out of space. But
Just maybe explain to folks who Mary is.
oh, I'm sorry, Mary Griswold, she owns the shipyard. She's the current owner of the shipyard. And she's been very generous with us for years to allow us to have storage space that's on site, but because of changes in how she does business, it's changed our ability to have storage. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to rebuild the storage shed building. It's a very old building. It's a pole barn constructed building. It's literally 1.5 feet or 2 feet in difference in elevation from one side to the other, and it's really not worth rehabilitating. And what we'd like to do is to tear that one down, build another building back on that same footprint with a foundation that would give us, a basement structure, a square building that we can insulate, because all of our guys literally work in coveralls and 20 below zero. There's no heat. And then the main powerhouse building, because of needs with bathrooms and clean space, because the winch occupies most of the space, we'd like to build a second floor that would give us an opportunity to have a clean space for a lunchroom, an office to put drawings and stuff on. But because of the zoning regulations, the way they're written, prohibit us from changing the square footage of the structures within the buffer zones. Now, there's a front buffer zone, what we consider the front of the lot, which is to your left in this slide here. But also the side buffers are also affected because the lot is literally so small. Sure.
Is that a buffer, Dean, or is it a?
Or setback, I'm sorry.
Setback, okay.
So it's a setback. So what we're trying to do is, we had gone through and read, and there was a similar occurrence with Quiniasca where the wording was changed that referenced the setback from the road. But because there's no main road in front of us, those changes don't have an effect on our lot. So there are some changes to words that could occur that are referenced in some material that was supplied to you, that some changes in those words would allow the changes that went into effect to have an effect on our lot as well, because we really have our hands tied with really no space. So, I think in a nutshell, that's kind of where we're at. And we really don't have any other options because we don't have any other land. And not a whole lot of choice on a small little lot. It's kind of a postage stamp of a place, but it's a very vital part of our company because we're required every 5 years to haul the ferry boats out. And as the boats get older, we're constantly trying to repaint. We're constantly trying to take the propellers out and the shafts out and the bulkheads rust. And, old cars and old boats need a lot of work. So
given some previous discussion that we had, Dean, from your perspective, are we still looking at just making this consistent for situations like this, or is this something that is unique enough to look at it uniquely?
Well, I think there are, and I haven't gone looking for other instances that are like this, but I'm guessing that there are some that are out there. I think what precipitated this idea originally was the fact that for them to do what they wanted to do would mean they would have to go to the DRB with a variance application. And because variance applications are unpredictable, you can try to avoid, if you can avoid them, it's usually worthwhile. But the way it would be avoided is through a zoning change. And it seemed like that if this issue had come to light when the Quiniasca issue had come to light, it would have been addressed in a way that worked for both. So, I mean, is that getting at what you're?
It does, and the main reason I was asking the question is because when I heard earlier that there's, like, the buildings are right up against the property boundary, then, I mean, making the setback anything but 0 would be irrelevant, right?
Well, yeah, I don't think that, this is in the same zoning district as Quiniesca. The rural district has a kind of variety of terrain in it, and it just so happens these are in the same district. There are some small lots in the rural district, but I would say that there probably aren't very many that are as small with an existing building that predates zoning. This lot was created, I think, around 56 or something like that.
Probably somewhere back there.
Yeah, so well before zoning and before anybody thought about these kinds of things. But I'm unable to say exactly how many lots. It wouldn't take that much work to tell you how many lots in the rural district that are this size. They're gonna be quirks like the residential property that's near the intersection of Dorset Street and Barstow that was a former school. You know, things like that where they had those buildings on really tiny lots.
What if Mrs. Griswold were to go in and sign on to the request for the variance as her property surrounds that property? Would that be a simple way of maybe getting a variance?
In my opinion, no, it shouldn't be, because the way that one administers zoning is it's not a popularity contest. It's looking at the requirements and assessing compliance. There isn't any aspect of the state statute regarding variances that has to do with whether or not your neighbors like it or will tolerate it. As a general principle, the idea of having neighbors sign on to a proposed change is frowned upon because there's no saying that, well, ownership isn't permanent. The neighbors can change and do change. So in my view, asking Mary Griswold to get on board it's a nice thing, but it won't determine the outcome or shouldn't determine the outcome under the statute and the application of the variance criteria. I mean, the situation is such that, like, Champlain Transportation has been looking at this project. I think there were some changes in personnel or something that got things off track in the spring. So they've lost a year, and it would be unfortunate for them to get tied up in a variance or have an attempt made at a variance, and we hold off on any zoning change. And then we're talking about maybe resolving this, you know, getting on towards summer, and then that just puts everything behind. So I think the idea was that if this seemed like, again, the kind of change that had this come up at the same time Quiniesca came up, it would have been addressed, then simply address it.
And sorry, I don't have the language in front of me, but the language that we were looking at was basically taking out the reference to proximity to the main road.
The language that had been shared with you before looked,
Or public highway.
like that.
Yeah.
So it removed the reference to public highway, which was in there because either Dave or I thought it just kind of made sense given the rural district, and we were talking about front yard setbacks, so refer to the highway. But it's not necessary. The front yard setback will be the front yard setback. And make it clear, since you're removing public highway, to say the lot frontage. And then the last sentence was just my kind of initial, for discussion only, idea to address the side yard piece of this as well. And because of the,
And the footprints of these two will be effectively the same or within this 25%. So
Well,
that, I
in
mean, just that still applies. That
in the-
still works, right? That number.
in the case of one of the buildings, I mean, I know that historically the foundation or the slab that the shed building was on was larger. If it has been more than 2 years, we don't count that historical piece. So that shed, as I understand it, is going to get longer. It's also going to get taller by a little bit. It's the volume. It's the growing up.
Yeah,
The
but we
footprints,
just-
even if the footprints are the same.
But
the
we talked
zoning
in
regs.
this language about footprint, right? So
Yeah,
I just want to make sure we came up with 25% there, that it wouldn't
right.
preclude,
It wouldn't,
yeah, what
no,
they're
that-
trying
it
to
would be
do.
within the 25%, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
In fact, the the main powerhouse building with a winch structure in it wouldn't change at all in its footprint. We're just looking to literally
Go up.
put a set of staircase on the inside and a second floor that would accommodate, an upstairs space for office.
And then in the shed building, you're talking about putting a permanent foundation in? Because right
Yeah.
now it's just dirt or something, or?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it was dirt for a long time, and then we kept the original pole barns. There's these old creosote telephone poles that go into the ground. And we just dug out on the inside, and we poured a 4-inch slab on the inside. But because water runs in all the time, the floor is cracked and things shift. And the building is, it's a very old building. So what we'd like to do is take out that existing slab and put a foundation in, because a foundation will allow us to actually have something that's stable, something that's dry, and something that we can heat. Because really, ultimately, it's a really tough job for the guys that work at the shipyard. And, we'd like to be able to have a shop where, if you're going to work for 2 hours inside, it's not 20 below zero. Your wrenches aren't sticking to your hands, and it'd be a decent space for them to work.
Yeah, what it is that you're talking about sounds great. I'm just mostly trying to navigate what's the easiest way
Yeah.
to work through this. 'Cause-
If we knew that a variance process would be done in 4 weeks,
right.
you could say, wait 4 weeks. I can tell you that, the coming agenda is full. It won't happen in
So it
4
wouldn't
weeks.
happen for a while.
And then it could conceivably take, a month and a half after that. It would just take some time and be unpredictable.
Doesn't it take almost as long for us to do these changes and run it through by the select board?
Right, but if the worst case, if we're trying to address the worst case scenario, it would be the addition of the two, and that's what I think you're trying to avoid, or some of us might try to avoid.
Yeah, and when I initially asked the question, after seeing the language, I have fewer concerns, because really what we're saying is a building can be modified not to exceed 25% of its existing footprint, but it clearly can't go over the boundary. So if a building is up to the boundary, that 25% footprint could be somewhere
Yeah, it'll
else.
never cross the
but it's not
boundary.
going to change anything.
Has to be
so that-
internal.
yeah, which doesn't really.
I have a question, though. I don't understand what these lines mean that
You
are
don't
on the map. The line is drawn through the building, and I'm just curious, is that supposed to be the lot line, or
Whoops.
is that?
Are you talking about?
It looks like the
This
crazy R's or something, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, I copied this from one of the other plans in the file. So the blue lines, that's contours.
I understood that one. The only one I was questioning was the one that runs through the building at the top.
The one
That's
that runs.
the yellow.
The yellow line.
with yellow symbols.
Okay,
Yeah,
so,
just curious what that
this
is.
is the property line here. It's PL, it's upside down. I inverted it so that it was
Okay.
north up. And so the property line, literally, it's not running through the building because I've got this yellow highlight. I wanted to draw your eye to it, but I went beyond the boundaries.
So that's not the boundary.
Yeah,
then.
So the hatch, do you see underneath the yellow, Dick, there's like a
Okay, yeah,
hatch?
yeah.
That is what was
Yeah.
proposed as the expansion.
I was too
No,
lazy.
that's not the proposed expansion. That's just highlighting the location of the building. The building itself, the boundary of the building is not gonna get any closer, because it can't go over the property line, obviously. That was just to draw attention to it.
Yeah, I was too
Okay,
lazy
so
to
the-
just limit it to the inside. I just drew a box, turn it yellow.
Okay, so what we're looking at is that skinnier rectangle that
Correct.
is what it's,
Yes,
is the
exactly.
current and proposed, okay? Okay.
Sorry for that confusion there.
I just have a question, the historical context, like when originally Ferry Company owned that other property that was sold, or
Yes.
was it the other way around?
No, it was. The property, I don't even know when the ferry company acquired it, but it goes way back. This is where all the lake steamers, this is the dry dock with the Ticonderoga and the Chateauguay and the
Very historic,
Champlain and the Champlain 2, all the big old paddle side wheelers used to come up and be pulled out of the water. That's where the maintenance was done forever. And as the ferry boat company has built new boats, and actually built in place new boats, the dock has been modified over time. So, in fact, we just went through a reconstruction to change the structure itself, the framework of the railway and the track itself, because it was built originally in 1929, was getting pretty old. So,
And are you
But-
recognized as a cultural resource for Shelburne, or like one of those historical?
There are markers out there. I mean, the short answer is yes. The site as a whole, I believe, is on the state historic register. And it's included, the site, again, I don't know how detailed it is for individual buildings. But there's no regulatory component to that designation.
I see. That's what I was getting at, like maybe there are some,
If this
Like historic
property was
preservation.
in the historic preservation and design review overlay district, there would be some applicable criteria, but there are not applicable criteria in this location. If this was a project that for some reason was, well, I would say this, if there was somehow federal money that was going into the buildings, there would probably be a requirement for some kind of historical assessment. But it's probably the company's funds, and so there's no requirement on the part of the public agency that is, funding to do that or to meet certain, the Secretary of Interior standards.
The buildings, it's hard to say. The original, or the dry dock that's there now was built in 1929, and that building was there then. Prior to that, out in the field that's up above, they had these big capstan winches that horses used to walk around and around, and they had block and tackles, and they used to pull the boats out with horses. And that was in place for who knows how long. I mean, the company's been in operation since 1826. So I don't actually know how long they've
What
been
is
running.
that boat that's in there now?
That's one of the ferry boats that we work on. I don't know exactly which one it is. It's hard to tell from that.
Just looks different out of the water.
Yeah, so that's one of the Grand Isle ferry boats. I'm going to guess
Okay.
that's the Vermont. So it's the Vermont. So it's 196 feet long. That one was built in 1992. And basically we pulled them out of the water, and every 20 years you have to take the shafts out and have to take the cutlass bearings, and but every 5 years you pull the propellers off and repair cracks, and the hull gets painted. Yeah,
Yeah.
and all the Coast Guard requires us to open up any what are called through hulls. So all the plugs that go through the exterior hull of the boat, any valves that keep water out, they have to be inspected every 5 years. So actually quite a lot to running a boat.
Well, I think that the solution that Dean is suggesting is a rather elegant way to solve this problem, and I would support it.
It also seems like it catches up with things we just weren't thinking about then. That I was just trying to think of, like, what else would we be? What's the next question that comes up? Be like, oh, if we'd only done that when we did this one and that one. Like, it doesn't seem like we're missing any other, side setback. We've got now side setback, front setback.
Yeah. So if the direction that the commission is going in is to move it forward, then it would be something that would go on an upcoming agenda. It would have the report done, and I'm guessing that maybe something else could come along with this. But materials would be prepared so that you could make a motion to warn a public hearing, is the short of it.
And
Can't do
then-
that tonight, but
Right, and the timeline through this process then would be if we could do that at the
at your next meeting,
then,
then early January, the hearing would take place.
right, and then that would go to, at best, the select board's next available.
Yeah, my guess is, the select board's going to be pushing things into the end of February, so probably the second meeting in February.
All right. Yeah, mostly just to get a general idea of timeline.
That's actually fast for us.
That,
Yeah.
We're from 1826.
right,
I think you're doing really great service for Shelburne.
Yeah.
absolutely.
You spotted.
Yeah, the only I was just trying to think through scenarios that we might want to get ahead of, and I think the way the language is right now, the only concern I could see is from anything on an existing footprint is, to me, it's effectively grandfathered. You could let it sit there and age out until it's died and decrepit, but it would make sense to have something that if that footprint is degrading, then upgrading it should be fine. The only question that I could see from a neighbor, and in this case, the shipyard wouldn't have a problem with you doing this, it would seem.
No,
But-
I don't think so.
I'm just trying to think of other scenarios where this could be in terms of how we might tweak our language. And the 25% of the existing building footprint, if that extends along a property boundary, then there could be a situation where a neighbor could say, well, I don't want you to extend it further along the boundary, like go into your property versus along the line, which doesn't apply in this case. I'm just trying to think of,
Yeah, I thought we
Which might be a
talked about
good
that a
thing.
little
Talked about it a
bit
little bit
because
last
the distance is going to be, governed, I'm trying to remember my old
It's a condition-
arithmetic,
conditional
it's
use.
25%.
oh, right, that's
Conditional
fair,
use,
yeah.
So-
Okay,
So there is
So
an
that's-
opportunity to participate in the development review process as a neighbor and say,
is a
I
conditional
have,
use
I have a
review,
problem
yeah.
with this, or I would prefer to see it solved in this way, whatever. So it's not like this is, something that's just a fait accompli.
Right.
that's, yeah, totally
Yeah.
fair. Yeah, I don't,
I'm fine.
we're all, yeah, sounds like.
So we'll
you
tee it
good,
up
Suzanne?
for an upcoming agenda. I don't know that a motion's required, but if you wanted, but
I'll make a
my
motion.
understanding would be,
Sure.
I move that staff prepare language to enable this change, to change from a setback from a road to a setback from a lot line for, what are we calling these? Pre-existing, non-conforming properties, commercial properties? That sound good? Okay.
I think as long as Marion gets it, I think the understanding is this would be the model here. The only thing I would add is, or suggest is that if you're going to make a motion, then also just reference the preparation of the bylaw change report, because that'll need to go along with it. So I'll
Okay.
be preparing the bylaw language and the report.
So moved.
Moved by Kate. We have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Andrew. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get that on an agenda
So
and keep the ball
another
moving.
100 years, hopefully, right?
Right.
Thanks for your
Yeah,
help. Thanks for your
thank
time.
you for the
Appreciate it.
explanation. Excellent. All right.
So as mentioned, Pam is not able to attend.
Do you want to swap a bit and on the fly? Because
Sure.
yeah,
If you want to do that.
sure. I mean,
What about fences? Let's talk about fences.
yeah, it's for fences, which is the last one.
Okay.
Right, you're here for the fence.
I'll be leaving.
I'm mostly just here to listen unless there are any, I'm happy to have a conversation if the commission has any questions.
Yeah, well, we just have 3 more topics under zoning, so, well, that's one of them, so we could, if we can just adjust our order on the fly, then you wouldn't need to stick around unless you want to. You're more than welcome to hang out all night.
Yeah. Let's do that.
Okay, so if we're all good with that,
makes sense,
then we'll
yes.
talk about the anticipated select board action pertaining to fences and PUD buffers.
I was curious why we didn't get that as opposed to the select board.
Well, maybe this will become clear. I have a copy of an email that Lee Crone sent. He sent it to me and to Jason yesterday at 5:04. And I should have made paper copies, but I neglected to do that. But maybe if people want to just read it, I can let you do that, or I can read it. So, which would you prefer?
I don't mind if you read it, to be honest.
Okay, so I think the second paragraph says, this relates to litigation brought against the town by Nate Burris, a homeowner in Beaver Creek PUD, who was denied a permit for a fence in his desired location in the buffer, which in this part of the town restricts structures within the 75 feet deep buffer zone. The town has already spent $12,000 in legal costs defending this matter while understanding the need to uphold the integrity of the bylaws and not suggesting that we should change our bylaws just because someone was denied a permit or sued us in court. There are times when it's reasonable to revisit the rules to make sure they still make sense and are serving a valid purpose. So what happened is that this issue was on the select board's agenda, and the select board confirmed that they would like the planning commission to look at this or consider this issue. They don't want to make it sound like they're telling you what to do, but they did confirm they want you to look at it, and that's what prompted Lee to send this email. Then his email goes on to say, specific question is whether fences should still be included in the definition of structures for purposes of defining prohibited structures. I'm not quite sure that's the best way of saying it. It's really a question of, should fences be allowed? A fence will always be a fence. A fence is a structure. So it's not a question of whether or not they should be considered structures. It's whether or not they should be allowed in the PUD buffer, because right now they're not. And he says, from his own perspective, it may well make sense to prohibit structures such as homes, bigger things. So the next paragraph is the one where I think he's trying to make it clear the select board is not trying to tell you what to do. They're not advocating for a change. They're not advocating for a specific position, but they want to ask the commission to consider a change. If it's found reasonable and acceptable, such a change could help resolve this particular litigation, as well as similar potential concerns on other properties. So that's the essence of it. Now, Lee had raised this issue with me before the select board meeting and was asking, for some orientation and what section of the bylaws would this affect? And I said, well, 1930.3 is where, in my view, this comes to bear. And one possible way to address it would be to zero in on this paragraph A3. And basically, if there's a structure already in a buffer, and there's this has happened historically. There's a piece of land, like there's one I can think of out on Harbor Road. There's a barn that has been in this location next to Harbor Road for many, many years. I think the Boy Scouts used to store things in there. Anyway, a person acquired the property and did a PUD and created 3 house sites. And in the end, there were only 2 because someone bought 2 of them. Now, it's PUD, there needs to be a buffer. The way this language is written, it says the fact that there's a building in that location within a buffer doesn't prevent someone from proposing a PUD. Because the building's there, it gets to stay there, someone can go ahead with a PUD.
Was that the March 17th, 2009 date?
That's where that comes in.
Okay.
And
That was my question, was what happened?
what happened then? Well, what happened just before that is that there were cases where the legal attorney, the legal advice we were getting is, you can't do that. So we actually had a situation on Dorset Street where a developer did a project, and the first thing they did was they carved out a piece of land for a building so that it wouldn't be in the buffer, and basically did the PUD around it. And people thought, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yeah. So that's what happened years ago and resulted in this language that's highlighted here to say that if the structure's there, it gets to stay there, but otherwise it's supposed to be kept clear except to gain access. And my thought was that a simple way to address this, if there was the sense that a fence could happen in that buffer and not be deleterious, just say, with the exception of fences, or with the exception of fences less than 8 feet in height, and structures existing as of March 17, 2009, the perimeter buffer must be kept free. So that's one
Fences
way.
are prohibited by language because that word structures is there and fence is considered a structure?
Yes, a fence is a structure, and structures other than those that are allowed in the buffer.
Right, because that was the other thing I circled was, the word structure is just
It's
so incredibly vague. Right?
It's broad. I
Right,
mean, it
broad.
captures everything
Okay, yes.
because that was the
Yeah,
intention.
got it.
I think normally, in a lot of zoning codes, fences below 6 feet and below are not even considered structures.
Not in the majority. I've done a little bit of reviewing of bylaws. They're generally subject to permits because they're allowed on property lines, and there's things that can make neighbors react. So the fact is that they're considered structures. There may be some, other treatment, but they're generally allowed. They're generally considered structure. They may be on a list of structures that are exempt from permit requirements, which is something our bylaw doesn't have a long list of. It does have some items. But that's what you find more typically is that a fence below a certain height might be exempt from a permit requirement. Just like in our case, a single dock in the lake is exempt from a permit requirement.
Yeah, and I think reading through this, and I know there are answers to this, but the questions that were popping into my head is what's the purpose of the setback in the first place? Like
The purpose of the PUD buffer is
buffer.
is different. I mean, if you read the literature, there's a book that has been in my office since who knows how long that kind of reflects thinking from a long time ago when PUDs were coming into vogue that talks about the buffer as the offset for increased activity within a development. So typically with PUDs, you're bending certain rules that otherwise you would be held to, and there's more activity or more intensity than otherwise would occur. You can combine things that might otherwise have to be over 5 acres and you can put them on 1 acre. So there's more intensity. Well, what do you do in those situations? You make sure that you don't have an impact on the surrounding area by requiring a buffer. So the basic theory is that it's the offset for the additional activity or intensity that takes place within. Now, over time in Shelburne, the buffer requirement has been, I would say, chipped away or reduced on a district by district basis. There are some places where, I believe in the mixed use district, there used to be a buffer requirement that was larger than the setback. And then not that many years ago, it was changed so that the buffer was whatever the setback was. So effectively, there's no difference in distance. That is not the case in the rural district or the residential district.
So, and I guess similar to the last discussion, I guess just thinking through where this could go. So, I mean, the extreme case would be that a residential PUD happens and then a fence gets put around the whole thing, including the setback and buffer.
So if someone was doing a development and they were proposing a fence around the outside of the PUD, I'm not sure if the DRB would authorize that. Fence would not normally be part of a PUD proposal unless it was a commercial PUD.
This buffer is not open land. This is just a buffer on the property itself. So I don't think the buffer was ever intended as public access, so the
No,
fence
it's not.
wouldn't be.
No, yeah, not a public access thing, but it was, I mean, the questions that were just popping up in my head is if it's, I mean, is the goal open space?
Yeah, I was thinking the
Is it-
same way.
Is it to reduce permeable surfaces or to impermeable surfaces? Like,
So the perimeter buffer should be thought of as separate and distinct from the open space requirement. The open space requirement in PUDs historically was larger than it is now, but I think for large properties it was 50%. So open space is supposed to be in a large enough block to have some meaningful purpose or that it fulfills the purpose. So if it's a large enough block of agricultural land, you can actually do some agriculture on it, as one example. The buffer is more of a ribbon, a band. It's not going to necessarily be something that you would keep intact for wildlife because, it may
we
result.
have one in our neighborhood. I know.
Yeah. If you,
around Boulder Hill, and because I was the head of the neighborhood association, we definitely ran into people like going into that buffer and trying to do stuff, and it wasn't their land; it was kind of shared land. And
And the
Yeah.
open land for this project is on the opposite side of the road from where you enter.
right,
There's
But
a
this is a
huge
buffer,
wetland on the,
like that would
towards-
hit Quiniasca,
towards the
basically the
pond.
course.
it's adjoining the Quiniesca property.
right.
And, yeah. So I just, this was on the agenda for 5 minutes to explain that we anticipated the select board might do something on Tuesday night. They did in fact do that. And we received this communication yesterday from Lee, which was to ask the commission to consider this. So more time on this than I had intended, but the stage is set.
Yeah, it is. So from moving forward, is this something that, I don't know, do we think about it and then next meeting decide whether or not we want to add that to the zoning change that we just had?
It's entirely up to, yeah, I mean, this,
Seems like, yeah, it seems like it would be good to keep them in lockstep, just so that we're not,
It
you know,
does.
have everything
Yeah.
go to us once, go to the select board once.
Do we have any parameters for fences, anything, controls?
the height limit, some
Height.
towns will have a limit, we
I
don't.
just pulled Williston's tonight. I was sitting in the office killing time. And they have height, for instance, 6 feet in height above grade, except as provided for by the Williston Development Review Board. And then front yard fences are limited to 42 inches in height. It's just not my idea, it's just what they do.
Yep.
I don't know if we need to do any of this. Do we want to?
So can I ask something?
But aren't there
Let me
also,
just,
a good
if I can
question,
just
yeah.
quickly respond to that. We are unusual in that we don't have a separate height limit for fences. That is something that you do commonly see, that there would be a cap on a fence. We don't. I will also say that in the design review district, so in the village, there are specific guidelines having to do with what you were just describing, where there's a lower height limit recommended for fences that are in the front yard, or basically any fence that's in front of the building front line has to be lower than those that are on the side or the rear. So it's not in the zoning directly, but it's in the design review book that the zoning refers to for the village. It wouldn't be the case outside the village.
So can I ask a question? You're the applicant, I assume?
Yes.
You want to just
Do you
yeah.
have an idea of what fence would be suitable? Or what are you asking for?
I think I probably would meet that 42-inch. This would be a small residential fence, wrought iron style, picketed.
So it's more of a notification than a barrier.
A barrier enough for small children is really all it's intended to be.
Oh, okay, I was just curious.
Can I ask a question? I'm wondering, Dean, in that buffer area, could a person who is, impacted by this, right now plant a hedge in that buffer? Would that be considered a structure?
No, a hedge wouldn't be
Then
considered.
what
a
is the
structure.
difference?
Would be there.
What is this? What is the
I
difference?
see no difference. I mean, the point, it's, the goal is the same, to restrict access.
is there any, question for you would be, is there any Beaver Creek rules or regulations? I just know, because we live in Boulder Hill, similar kind of thing, and we definitely have a few things around fences and height. I mean, it sounds like yours would conform to all that, but it's like 4 feet, has to be able to see through it, but.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to cross the line of talking about the application of the rule as
Yeah.
opposed to the theory behind it. I'm more here to talk about the
No,
theory.
just
but
like,
to be,
there's no neighborhood rules that would, whatever we do, the neighborhood's not going to say, sorry, you can't build a fence there.
The
'cause we have-
HOA doesn't
HOA,
preclude it.
yeah.
no, the homeowners association has already approved it, as have my abutting neighbors.
Okay.
Great,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah, Beaver Creek was, I believe, the first
ridiculous.
CUD, or it was a PRD in Shelburne.
Well, I just know, like, because Boulder Hill, we've had neighbors be like, this is good to go, right? And you're like, well, have you looked at the neighborhood bylaws, which might be different than town rules and regulations? We've just
Yeah.
had a few things where everything's good to go through from the town's perspective,
But
but
not
they
from
haven't
the-
really ever reviewed the
HOA
neighborhood
can be
rules.
the harder one,
Totally,
actually, in
yeah.
my personal experience
Yeah.
with my neighborhood.
So I just wanted to make
So
sure
they're
that you
not-
didn't get like
Hedges are not.
us saying
fences.
go and then the neighborhood being like, whoa, what are you
Sure.
doing? Yeah.
So somebody, in theory, could, Mr. Burris, for example, could plant, like, I don't know, a 12-foot high hedge right now in the buffer, and that would be totally fine to do.
Well, the regs would in some ways encourage it. It encourages it to be landscaped. The language is, it must be landscaped, screened, or protected by natural features. So the idea is that a hedge would create a barrier. It would improve or enhance that buffer. So yeah, that's entirely
So I
consistent.
guess
with
the
it.
question is, what is landscaping? I would argue that, a fence such as he has described would be landscaping.
If I can just comment on that, the definition of screening in the bylaws includes fences
Aha.
explicitly.
Interesting.
Yeah, we get into a bunch of things, and again, this was a 5-minute item, and I don't want to throw off your entire agenda.
We're ahead of schedule.
That's awesome.
Not for
Okay.
long.
Yeah.
Well, but we flipped some things too.
Right. No, I know. I'm joking.
So, yeah, we could spend some time talking about the definition of structure, definition of landscaping, the fact that there is an overlap. We've already had, a resolution, the question previously, is a fence a structure? It is. The situation that we are in right now would be addressed by saying specifically a fence is something that can be in a buffer in some way, shape, or form. If people are saying a fence, if it's because it's similar to landscaping or a hedge and that's a justification, that's fine. If the result is something that would allow it to happen, because the history of this particular case is an application was filed and it was denied and it was appealed and it was denied and it's in front of the court, and the court, basically on like 4 out of 5 things agreed with the town, and it's coming back on a particular kind of esoteric question. But the regs will need to be changed if they're going to say to the zoning person, you can issue a permit for a fence in a perimeter buffer.
Yeah, and I'm all for making things easy. I think my main concern is what I was envisioning, and not necessarily specific to you, but if there is a buffer and then a resident is able to build a fence within that buffer that goes into it, that's great if it's just a fence. But most of the time when people put up fences, then you end up with play sets and sandboxes and who knows what else that could go in there. And then at what point does somebody 10 years later say, well, wait a second, now there's a fence and a whole bunch of stuff in there that violated it, and then people get really pissed off.
Yeah, I will say that just as a practical matter, enforcing the buffer requirement does get more difficult, because there tends to be, it's not unusual for the individual to start appropriating that other space.
And I'm
it
thinking
becomes a
of
difficult thing
areas
to-
that,
So this fence wouldn't be at your property line, it would be across your property line in this buffer area.
Is the buffer on your property?
I think
The buffer is inherently on a private landowner's property.
Okay.
It's not homeowner association space.
Okay.
It necessarily is an area of space that is owned by a private landowner.
By you, okay. Because we have a little different thing in Boulder Hill where we have, like if you zoom in on Boulder Hill, there's a strip of land kind of on the bottom part. You can see sort of trees ring the bottom part of Boulder Hill. That's actually all a buffer that no one can touch. And,
Yeah, I'm trying to get the parcel lines on there.
Yeah.
Take me a second.
But, so that's why I was a little confused, because the property line ends here, then there's a 25 to 50 foot buffer to the other houses, really as a sort of courtesy to them, to kind of protect the chaos of the neighborhood from them. But we as residents can't build into that buffer. But it sounds like the buffer is part of each property line in your case, or each property parcel has a buffer component to it.
As long as it's on the edge of the PUD
Right.
as a whole, the interior properties
Won't have
wouldn't be
any
affected.
buffer. Got it.
Could I just take 60 seconds to sort of give you a sort of perspective on just the bylaws as they're written, as you consider this on your own? And I don't know if it's possible, Dean, to pull them back up.
The whole bylaw, just,
You had that section 1930.
Okay, just 1 sec here.
So to be clear, I'm of course supportive of this idea. I think it would add clarity. I would say that from my perspective, it would sort of be a belt and suspenders approach, in that I think as written, and this of course would, I guess, play into your decision as to whether there even needs to be an amendment, but fences would be permitted as written. And so if you look at 1930.3 A3, where there's the highlighted section, right above that, the very first sentence starts with minimum side and rear yard setbacks. And so if you pay attention to the phrasing there, yard setbacks, the buffer zone is defined there as a yard setback. And if it's possible to go to 1980.6.
So this is just a screenshot of this section?
Okay.
So it's not the whole bylaw, that's why I was saying it would
Oh,
take me a
sure,
minute.
sure.
And the other thing I'm going to say, Mr. Chairman, is I'm going to beg your indulgence and ask that Mr. Burris not try to relitigate what has been decided by the E-Court essentially in the town's favor, if that's where this is going, because the judge has essentially agreed with the town's interpretation of the regulations and what they mean. I can appreciate that if he would like to make some suggestions, maybe in writing, about how he would like to see those things addressed for the benefit of others beyond, but the interpretation of the bylaws and what is allowed in the buffer and what's not, and that's been addressed by the judge. If this goes to the Supreme Court, then maybe the Supreme Court will decide differently. But the idea of saying yes to a fence shouldn't necessarily bring in all these other things.
And just, that's why at the beginning I was saying I'm trying to be very careful not to discuss anything other than the theory of what is written insofar as it relates to your consideration of this issue. I definitely disagree. I don't think that is accurate as to the decision, but I'm staying away from that. I'm trying to focus on what is, going to be relevant to your decision.
Yeah, and my
here.
main thing, just knowing that there was litigation going on, my first question was whether or not, or how much of this we should be talking about, just given that is in play somehow.
Well, the Planning Commission it's the Development Review Board that will be taking up this matter, because the judge ruled and remanded a particular aspect of the case back to the DRB. So the DRB is going to be taking some additional testimony to resolve one particular question, an avenue that Mr. Burris was trying to go down, some facts he wanted to present, an argument he wanted to make, and at the time, the chair of the DRB said, we're not going to go there. We're not going to consider whether or not the town has given permits for other fences in the perimeter buffer or not enforced or things like that. He basically shut down that, and the judge in this environmental court case has said, they should have given Mr. Burris his time to make his argument, and so that's what the DRB will be doing. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can't talk about things. It's just...
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not here, to be clear, I'm not here in any way to relitigate anything. I think at the select board meeting, Dean had suggested that it was appropriate for the homeowner to come here, and so at
No, I'd
that
be
suggestion,
curious
that's
to
why
hear
what-
I'm
absolutely.
here.
I just want to make
I'd like
sure
to
that
hear
no-
what you were going to
yeah.
say next, because, I'd hate to your point, it sounds like you have a potentially more elegant solution, I'd be interested whatever other section you were talking about and how that would fit.
Sure. So I mentioned that this section defines a periphery buffer as a yard setback, and a subsequent section, 1980.6, creates an exception for fences in yard setbacks. So the exception says that fences can be placed in yard setbacks. A periphery buffer is a yard setback. And so I guess my point was just in your considerations, I would suggest that you're able to consider whether this is even a necessary change. And I'm supportive of it because I think it would be, as I said, sort of a belt and suspenders approach to add clarity that I think is much needed. But that was just going to be the
It's always
introduction that I wanted to make.
Sure. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's always fun when planners are in this position of having to argue these things with attorneys, but that's not what it said. The court has sided with our interpretation. If what Mr. Burris is saying is true, we wouldn't be here. He would have his fence permit.
So what we're being asked to do is to, my understanding, is to consider, is there some kind of a better arrangement that we can come up with going forward? And I believe that fences it can have a very sort of rural vibe that fits with the character of a rural subdivision, and I believe that we should consider allowing them, and that, we can set some constraints on our expectations for what they would look like. This is similar to what we did, and child safety is important, right? This is similar to what we did recently in the Lakeshore Overlay District, where I believe, within the last year.
Jeff
or so-
Halverson came, it was
Right.
Yeah.
comparable.
Well, same kind of thing, a house situated on a bluff, concern of, understandably, of grandchildren, needing to be restrained, pets and so forth. So I see this as very similar. And, Quiniesca has been allowed to expand what they do. And yet it seems like the people who are bounded, live right next door to Quiniesca are being restricted in terms of how they can kind of mitigate this activity. And if the whole purpose of the PUD buffer is to, offset the added intensity, presumably of within the PUD, well, it would seem like the people who live within the PUD also should get to have a way of mitigating the added intensity of whatever's happening with their neighbor. And a fence is a very traditional way to do that. And particularly since, there would be no prohibition against growing, a very manicured wall-like hedge that would serve exactly the same purpose, but much more kind of in-your-face way. I don't see why. I think it's important to expand on what is allowed in perimeter buffers for rural PUDs.
Does Quiniesca have a buffer as well?
Quiniesca is not a PUD.
So there's no buffer between the two properties?
There's not a
Setbacks?
buffer requirement. There are setbacks.
Is the setback 50 feet or?
I'm trying to remember what the setback is there in the residential district.
I'm happy to.
If
So
Nate recalls,
it's going to be 260 feet because it's based on the length of the property, probably a little over 260
right.
feet. It's going to be based on the 10% of the length of the road frontage. So from the start of Quiniesca on Spear Street on the southern end to the northern end is, I think 2,600. It's about 260 feet. But of course, the course goes right up to the edge of the property line.
Yeah, and Kate, with what you were just saying, I get that, and if our bylaws don't distinguish between hedges and fences, then that's another thing to talk about. I would still have the same issue though, is if somebody put up hedges to delineate within a buffer zone, whatever is within that fenced-in area still has a potential to end up with a bunch of stuff in it. And I think if the point of the buffer was to not have a bunch of stuff there, then that would be the issue. If there is no issue around keeping that space open and just making sure that there's no actual structures on it, that's different. There may be some enforcement issues if swing sets or whatever get built and that makes somebody unhappy, but I think the issue is if the point of the buffer is not for something like open space or drainage or something like that, then I don't.
Well, drainage is allowed in a buffer.
Well, right, sure. But if there are like stormwater considerations or views or whatever it may be, I mean, at this point, just what you have suggested, I think would solve this. My main concern when I was reading this was, what is the point of the buffer, and would that create future problems by allowing fences to be built in buffers?
Yeah, so there's one other definition that if I can find.
And it doesn't, from what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like it, unless within that PUD there was some kind of a condition that says that this buffer needs to be maintained as open space or something like that. And then clearly homeowners associations would have their own.
Well, yeah, I think there's some additional information that may shed light.
Is that, this feels weird because I feel like I'm on the opposite side that I'm normally on. Normally I feel like other people are talking about being in space and stuff, and
I'm just curious about the implications broadly throughout the town. If this shifts, then what? Are there fences blooming up everywhere? And what does that look like?
That was why I asked the question about whether the buffer was on the lot or was it a separate
Right.
property.
I think if you were to drive around town and go through some of the existing PUDs, you'd see that there are already fences in the buffer zones.
Well, and that's the thing. That's my next thing, is it becomes an enforcement issue. If we're just creating more issues for enforcement, then is there a better way to address this than like this? But
Yeah, the definition of buffer may shed some light on this. Generally kept in a natural state. visually separate one use from another, shield, block noise, lights, other nuisances, protect a natural resource. So that's, why a buffer? Well, that's,
Yeah, I mean, the way that's worded doesn't really
doesn't really do it for you,
solve
but anyway.
anything in my mind, but yeah, that is.
So green lawn wouldn't really cut it as a buffer, just green lawn, because how is that going to do those things? If someone was coming to the DRB with a proposal that some large-scale residential development was going to be separated from an area by just green lawn, they might say, how about plant some trees?
Well, but visually separating from one
19
use
can
to
you-
another.
Get to 1980s.
Well, yes, this is a section, again, that I'm going to have a really hard time resisting explaining to you is not applicable in this case. It was
80.6.
I hate touchpads here.
And it's C.
Oh,
At the top
sorry.
there.
This is not a yard setback.
Right, based on what the court came back with, you're saying. Yeah, I mean, that aside, I
So how far is what is the yard without the buffer?
From the edge of the house to the edge of the property line, I think is 74 feet.
So you're saying that the buffer is actually into your house?
It's 50
50
feet, not
feet.
75.
50 feet.
It used to be 75, which made, I think, the house a non-conforming structure, but the buffer was reduced from 75 to 50.
and if we did add this language, then that fence could go all the way to the
Is that what we just did?
line.
Is that what?
The buffer change? Did we just change the buffer?
No, it wouldn't. It's not affecting this buffer.
These, and maybe I'm just not a PUD expert, but if you have a like you could end up with any PUDR just with a big giant fence around it. Ultimately, right?
Potentially,
Like
I
all the
suppose.
properties included in it could have a fence around the whole
Except
thing.
Not now, because we don't allow structures, and fences are considered structures.
If
Right.
Well,
with
if they're
with
to
this
change.
change, right?
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
So it would be like that Larson cartoon where
Midvale School for the Gifted.
that has all these fences and buffers.
Right. Yeah, if from my perspective, if there isn't any concern with needing to, the definition of buffer didn't really help me out because I feel like that could be interpreted depending on who's reading it. But if there isn't a consideration for needing to protect that space in some way or keeping it open, because I don't see how putting a fence around a buffer it's no longer open and that space could continue to have stuff put on it. Not structures, but somebody could, I mean, you could put a shed on there and nobody would know until somebody pointed it out and then complained about it.
I have a permitted shed, permitted inside the buffer.
Which was permitted in error.
Oh, right.
Oh, boy.
So he doesn't have to take it out.
Was that right? So the shed can stay.
Oh, boy.
My first reaction when I saw March 17th, 2009 was somebody lost a bet on St. Patrick's Day at a bar, but anyway. Yeah, sorry. Had to say that out loud.
Not for the minutes.
Right. Thanks, Marianne. Our, well,
I think when you look at something that the regulations say should be a certain way, and then you look at the real life condition, and it seems nonsensical, then it's time to revisit the regulations and change them and bring them both up into a little closer alignment. And I
Completely
think this
agree.
is a situation like that.
I think we need to set time
Which-
aside for this, to do this.
because I feel like that this could open up a bigger issue. I think
Absolutely.
and quite frankly, I think that there are bigger issues that we need to address in terms of simplifying what our bylaws look like and that sort of thing. And this to me doesn't seem like it's making it simpler, it's making it more complex, but at the same time, I understand that's balancing out against solving a current problem. So what, if this were to take a deeper dive, like what sorts of things would?
I think I'm thinking that we need to see how it will affect other
Yeah.
PUDs. And if it will.
Meaning what?
Well, in the past, Dean, like you've mapped out, that I can't even remember what we were talking about, but there was I guess it was the 5 acre, 10 acre thing. What other properties will this affect?
So if we were to create a map, determine all the parcels that are in PUDs,
Right.
and then
Well,
Just
we'll have,
highlight them.
I mean, are most buffers part of ownership? Are they part of the individual lots, or are they separate strips?
there are some places that are coming to mind where it's association land, and there are places, and probably more places where it's not association land. It's part of the lot owner's land. But I can't quantify. I'm not going to be able to say easily, it's 2/3 that are in private ownership. I'd want to look at it first. It's gonna take some time to get that information together. First determine what lots are in PUDs. What PUD are they part of? So then the question is that how could it affect? So just imagine what if there were fences around the outside of those PUDs.
Usually the buffer is to protect the other property, not the property of the buffers. Or, no, I guess it goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's usually there's stuff that existed, there was woods and fields, and now someone's putting in a PUD. So you want to keep some sort of protection from the, like however Dean described it, the additional intensity.
And I feel like the gut reaction to this is that, I should not have used that phrase. Sorry.
Donald.
God,
You're that
please,
smarter than all the rest of us.
please, no. My initial reaction when I first read this was that the point of a buffer is to maintain visual open space, not open space in terms of open space and wildlife and that sort of thing, but even the definition that we read somewhere was that it's to visually separate things. And if you're building fences into that thing that is designed to visually separate, even if it's a 12-foot high hedge, that's clearly taking away from the point of visually separating because you're creating clutter there.
But if another PUD were to go in where the golf course is,
Right.
then that buffer might be more important. It would separate the neighborhoods to a degree.
But the buffer is still separating. That the point of the buffer
It wouldn't be
is
if
to
it had a
separate,
fence
right?
there. Because as you were talking about things, once the fence is in there, then other things are going to come.
Right, which becomes a huge enforcement issue that we're already challenged by.
Yeah, that's the
It's
that statement that makes me hesitate.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that we can't do this. That's just the quagmire that I'm seeing could come out of it. And what I think needs to be fleshed out a little bit, I'm just not sure what that looks like.
So
right
maybe the next step is at a future meeting, presentation of some, kind of scenarios. Look for like case studies, like here's the Boulder Hill development. Here's where the lots are. Here's where the buffer is. This is the Beaver Creek development. This was some other development that was a PUD, and that you could start to get your arms around what it might mean.
And I
That would
would
be helpful.
advocate taking a step further back and revisiting what the purpose of a buffer is in Shelburne. So what's the point of doing this what's the point of requiring this in the first place? I think that needs to be revisited.
Okay.
And then, whatever we do, it hangs from that framework. Because right now,
Well-
this is just random stuff that's in here that,
Yeah, I think the words are pretty clear. I think the issue may be, the question, Kate, fundamentally is, do you think it's important? Because the conclusion may be that it's not that important anymore. And like I
A
said,
buffer.
yeah, like I said at the
Well, maybe
outset,
in the
it's been
rural-
changing. Well, it's been changing in other districts. In the mixed-use district, it was brought to essentially be the setback. And then at least one other district where it
Well,
had been
I'm not
discussed.
suggesting that a buffer is no longer important, but I'm looking at something here that is a purpose statement that says that, talks about the purpose being to provide standards for the installation and maintenance of landscaping, walls, and screening devices so as to enhance the overall appearance of the community. This is accomplished by blah, blah, blah. So I think we need some sort of a purpose statement that talks about, provide some context for why we have a buffer in our PUDs, and we don't really have that.
Well, there is a purpose statement or section in the PUD section of the regs. And actually, I believe there are purpose.
Is it specific to
Well, there are-
buffers?
This is where I was just trying to get so that we could see that there is at least some, so. Okay, maybe so in addition to any specific purposes below, it is the intent of the section, okay, so that doesn't really tell you much. But now I'm understanding is that you would say, put something purpose in language of purpose in this place so people understand better why you're doing what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah, if that's
Seem to have mixed languages too, right? Like in the piece that we pulled out, 1930.3, it opens talking about minimum side and rear yard setbacks, and then later talks about this perimeter buffer. So it's kind of conflating the two things, saying,
Well, the buffer was used to create open land. In essence, kind of what we're doing now, different. Well, we still have a small buffer, but it's,
sure, but this
In general, I think
buffer
it
that
was-
they reference is defined as the minimum side and rear yard setbacks, right? They are.
I think they use it as a combination, kind of to maintain open. When you use a PUD in the day when this subdivision went in, they
Right.
use this as a way to maintain some open land between this project and whatever might occur in the next parcel.
and
Well,
that's
that-
really
So
where I'm coming from.
They
Well, that's
weren't
why I think
accounting
that
for a
having
golf
a
course
purpose
being there. It could have been
statement would
another
provide a
neighborhood.
framework
Exactly.
that provides some context for how these places maybe can evolve over time or adapt over time as things change. Because, I mean, I live in a place that was built 25 years ago. I mean, we don't live that same way
If you
anymore.
scroll
Yeah, and that's not to say that change
down,
can't
Dean,
happen.
to 19,
I'm
wherever the piece we were, so it's 1930.
And things happen in the case of
3A.
the Quiniesca, there's change that happens
Yeah.
around you. You should be able to
Down a
have
little
some
further.
ability to respond to that, I believe.
That number 3 there. But, I mean, it's, so with the exception of structures existing on March 17, 2000, this perimeter buffer, which refers back to what?
It's this area
The-
that's around the outside of the PUD.
That is a yard setback.
No,
Defined
it's
by-
not. It's different from a yard setback. It's this buffer area, this area that I described earlier as what's supposed to be this cushion that is part of a PUD.
Where is that defined?
so if the
In-
setback is 75 feet, the buffer is 50.
Well, Shelburne didn't create buffers. They adopted,
trying
we
to understand
adopted
where
our
the
original
buffer-
zoning from
buffer
other
is defined.
towns who
It
had
was
done
cut and
zoning.
paste from Connecticut
Sure.
somewhere, something like that.
Or
Well,
something.
so here, since I mean, we're not going to solve this right now, but so I think what needs a bit more discussion is we are highlighting some places where there may be some inconsistencies. We want to make sure that we get our heads around the language properly and how we're using buffers correctly. So I would suggest that we stick this on add some time to this and have some material to review ahead of time so that we can start narrowing this down. And I'd really like to start looking at these things through the lens of, if there's a broader thing that we can clean up, let's do that, so that we're not adding one-offs to change things, because the trickle,
Ripple
work on my,
effect.
yeah.
Yeah.
The bigger implications, the unforeseen consequences is what I'm more concerned about. It's certainly nothing personal or anything like that. It's just more like how can we make our rules where they make sense
And be clear.
and be clear,
Yeah.
right? And I think we are highlighting some gray areas, so maybe that's something where we can pick some targeted areas and start to tune those.
So it sounds like the judges decided that we are correct, possibly, but we are absolutely not clear, I think.
I do hope that this discussion doesn't come back to haunt the town, because I probably should have warned you a little bit more, but it may be a good time to wrap up your
No,
conversation.
I think that's good. We're definitely not going to solve this, and it sounds like as far as moving forward, that's going back to the DRB to relook at the situation for now anyway.
I'm happy to be responsive to your questions, but again, I want
Oh,
to be
yeah,
careful
that's
to.
fair. No, never mind, I'm
not,
sorry.
yeah.
It was mostly just because you were still standing there. And I was
Sure,
looking up,
sure.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I'd almost want to just let that play its course. I mean, I think we certainly have some work to do in this area, and it would be worth the discussion. And then, obviously, things will continue to unfold, and we can see how we dovetail into that. Does that work for this topic?
Yeah, let's move on.
All right. Yeah, thank you for coming
All
in
right,
on
thanks
it.
for coming
I'm
in.
sorry to take more than the 5 minutes allotted,
Yeah.
especially this late in the evening, but I appreciate your time looking into this.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
problem. Well, thanks for
thank
dropping
you.
by.
Thanks, Nate.
Okay. So then if we're hopping back, we go back to the Housing Committee?
Yes, and trying to carry the flag a little bit for Pam. I think some of the things that she would mention are that they did meet and discuss the one topic that had been raised as a possible addition to what had been developed so far, which was the definition of duplex or two-family dwelling. What people in the committee and I was understanding was that there was a comment or concern about how the way duplex is defined, it's gameable. So someone could have essentially two single-family homes connected very tenuously, and then be able to take advantage of these enhancements that are being written in or may be written in. So they came up with this modified definition of duplex that hopefully makes it clearer that a duplex that the units in the duplex have to hang together better. So I just pulled up onto the screen the email that Pam sent, and the larger text is what the Housing Subcommittee came up with at their last meeting. And to compare that to the current definition is to show you, whoops. It has some more detail and meat, I would say. So basically, we currently say a two-family dwelling structure containing two dwelling units designed for occupancy by not more than two families. There's nothing in it that gets at this idea of connection. And what Pam had, got my things open here. What the Housing Subcommittee had come up with is single building. They want to make it clear that we're talking about a single building containing two principal dwelling units that are separated by shared walls or floors, horizontal floors.
So would duplex just be added in the same vein as a two-family dwelling?
It would be, well, as part,
No, it
if this
would be
proposal goes
two-family.
forward, it would be a markup of the definition that I showed you. So it would be, more red line, it would be redlining this definition here.
Right, basically to define it as a duplex as the Housing Committee.
Yes,
Put together,
yes,
right?
if
Okay.
this group, if the commission agrees that, yes, that would be a good change, it would be incorporated into the proposal.
I guess
Would you
what I'd-
define it as dwelling, comma, duplex? Or
Right,
is it
that's
still
what I'm saying.
dwelling,
Yeah.
comma,
So-
two-family?
So they were working with a series of definitions from around New England and around the country, and we were kind of fast and loose. We had some bylaws that define, they use the term duplex, and others two-family dwelling, and others have some other terms too. So I think their point is that it's two-family dwelling, because that's what we call them, a two-family dwelling. So the definition would be of two-family dwelling. Although in her language, she said duplex. We wouldn't have a definition of both duplex and two-family dwelling.
Okay, that's.
So what do we
I was
do with
getting
the triplex?
We don't define triplex. I mean, if you want
So-
to add triplex,
A triplex can be constructed though, right?
well, we have multifamily dwelling.
Multiplex.
So
we don't-
multifamily is 3 and above.
Sorry. The zoning doesn't use triplex as a use anywhere.
But the definition does say 3 or above, and we've already got single window.
Real estate uses multifamily for 2-family and up as when they're listed.
So we'd just be different. Well,
Well,
because
different than real estate, but not necessarily different than what we're using it for. I don't know. If there's a uniform.
So I'm missing Dick, are you saying there should be a definition of?
No, I'm saying that when a duplex is listed, it's listed as a multifamily structure. So maybe a multifamily structure should have what they're saying a duplex has.
but there is a duplex is specifically 2 families.
No, but I guess the question is that multifamily doesn't say anything about separation by vertical or
Oh,
floor.
okay.
So
And yes,
do you
the-
need to extend it to that? Because you're really still talking
no,
about
okay.
one
Yeah.
building again, right?
Yeah, so the housing subcommittee's task, they're not proposing any changes to do with multifamily, and so their commentary was just limited to duplex and 2-family dwelling. It may be a very good idea to do what you're saying, and that is to, while you're at it, incorporate this concept in the definition of multifamily, yes. But when the housing subcommittee folks are working on it, their focus is duplex. That's why
I
they're,
was wondering, like, why would they be just focused on the duplexes? And the second question that I have is, there's a larger trend that in the places where there is housing shortages, like San Francisco or even Burlington, that the people want to convert their car garages into like apartments.
Accessory units.
Yeah, it's kind of like accessory units, and then but there are some zoning bylaw restrictions that's not letting them happen.
so we have
So
to.
is this
under-
kind of like
that's
debate
separate,
linked with
though.
that? Or
No,
this is
so,
separate
so
issue?
we have to just recap for everybody. State law protects the owner of a single-family home, state law protects their ability to establish an accessory apartment. That's one of the nuts that the housing committee wanted to crack, was to make the zoning allowances more generous, because there's a state minimum protection, but the state law also says that towns can go and be more generous. And our regs right now they're no more generous than the minimum. So the housing committee said, let's focus on making our accessory apartment language more generous. They thought, let's also, try to tackle duplexes, make it more attractive for duplexes. I think they felt like, let's turn a small boat around rather than an aircraft carrier, and not come to the planning commission with a proposal having to do with multifamily too, because they just wanted to get something that had a greater chance of moving forward, and they would do that by focusing on accessory apartments and duplexes.
So if we're okay with duplexes, the 2-family definition as they put out, it sounds like we would also want to extend at least the wall separator language to the multifamily as well.
That's what it
Is
sounds like
something
you are.
it sounds like. And then that takes us to Article 4 itself with the markups.
Yeah, that was presented as an example for one district, and I've done them for the rest, and that did show me some things, but
Because with the example that you had in the residential district, so the permitted uses, there's single family, 2-family, which would apply here, and then the accessory apartments. And a question on the accessory apartment section, if we're going to be messing around in here, is in 410.3, where it says accessory apartments located within an existing owner-occupied single-family dwelling or an existing accessory structure. When I first read that, my thought was, okay, so could somebody just build an accessory structure and then say, hey, it's existing, I want to turn that into a accessory apartment?
so remember that the way the regs are right now, so if someone wanted to do an accessory apartment that has 2 bedrooms in it, it's conditional use. Or if it's in a new building, it would also be a conditional use. So people will sometimes come to us and say, I want to build a garage and I want to have an accessory apartment in it. And we'll say, okay, It's a new building, you're gonna have an accessory apartment, that's gonna be a conditional use, and they'll go forward with that. And that'll be reviewed and most likely approved. Under this proposal, someone would get a permit for a structure, or I'm sorry, the way that this is being revised, it doesn't prevent someone from getting a permit for a building and then coming to get the approval for the accessory apartment. They would basically do it in 2 steps.
Okay. So okay.
And why is that a problem?
It's not that it's a problem. I just want to.
I mean,
You look at permitted uses and it just says, or an existing accessory structure, which means something that's already existing. But if I wanted to add an accessory apartment, so should I just build a structure and then later come back and say, yes, it's an existing structure. So
But
I
it's
want
not,
to.
I mean, you'd have to get a permit to build this other structure.
I
And then
agree.
A little
Every
bit
town
later.
is a little bit different.
I mean, you're either doing it all up front,
So
saying I'm gonna build it and it's gonna have accessory apartment, or I'm gonna build it and then later go back and have to get.
Williston allows you to build the accessory apartment up to 1,500 square feet, 2 bedrooms. They will allow you to build the accessory first, and you can build, and they allow 50% for a house. So you could build your primary house later, and you could build a 3,000-foot house added onto the accessory. That's what Williston does. It's kind of unique. But they have a limit of 1,500 feet on a 2-bedroom accessory. Every town has a limit on accessory apartment sizes.
Yeah, and that's good to know. I guess it was more just in cleaning up language and stuff.
yeah,
the way
I mean,
that
it
struck
could
me.
be modified to say existing, accessory apartments located within an existing owner-occupied single-family dwelling or an existing accessory structure or new structure, is what I think you're trying to
Well,
get
and
at.
that's really, yeah, I mean, I see that that's splitting hairs. I'm just wondering, since we just spent 25 minutes talking about stuff where
Yeah.
language was
Yeah,
getting
this
torn
wasn't in
apart.
their proposal earlier, but I don't think it,
Right.
I think it's fine, just make it clear.
Yeah, the concept that they're going for is great, because this would help with density. And
Yeah, although you've put up an additional hurdle by making it conditional use, not just permitted use.
It is already
Well,
a conditional
but
use.
410.3 is a permitted use.
Yeah, so
No, but if it's a conventional 20,000 square foot lot, they've got to go for conditional use approval to put a duplex.
well, that's for, so that's for the reduced land area. So it would only, now.
That's a half acre, basically, a little under a half acre.
Okay, but so we have to keep in mind that the text, 2-family dwelling with reduced area, this is gonna be something other than an accessory apartment. Now, this is making me think of something that I had meant to include before, which is that definition of duplex should make it clear that it's not, that accessory apartments are different. And so I think this is something that would have been maybe a little clearer if that was mentioned before. A 2-family dwelling is something beyond a house with an accessory apartment. So the only thing that would have a conditional use review is when you have 2 units and they're relatively equal in size, and you want to do it on the same size lot as a single family. There's no, under the proposal that was created by the Housing Subcommittee, there's no conditional use review required for accessory apartments. That's a pretty significant change.
What stops everybody on the street from converting their house to a duplex?
Well, it's going to depend on their lot size. And I mean, I was a little surprised that this seemed pretty well received last time, but it's embedded in this. Someone would have to look at their lot size. So what size lot are you talking about?
Well, I
mean, if someone.
don't have a problem with what we have right now. I don't understand the difference of reducing it 3,300 feet. What is the point of that?
Well,
For the 2-family dwelling, they've changed it from 30 to 26,640, whatever, for whatever reason.
Because it enables more of them to actually happen.
yeah, they wanted
I
to,
mean, if you're serious about doing this,
My-
you can't put the bar so high that nobody can actually do it.
Well, I think people can do it for the most part, but are we looking at new lots for the two-family?
So most likely, someone who takes advantage of the conditional use is going to be doing a project. I don't think that there would be very many owners
The
of a single.
densities that we're looking at right now, the only town that is probably maybe South Burlington and Burlington. All the other towns are pretty close to where we are now. And I don't have a problem with that, but what I do have a problem with is the possibility that we have neighborhoods, people buy single-family homes, owner-occupied, single-family neighborhoods, and people will be converting to duplexes and apartments, and I believe it'll change the character of those neighborhoods. People will not have what they bought when they moved in. And if somebody puts a duplex in and it's rentable, both units, so there's no owner-occupied, it's a different type of structure. I live across the road from two duplexes, actually. And occasionally, depending on the tenants, some are good, some are bad. But it's mostly a single-family neighborhood, and one of the duplexes has been owner-occupied, and there's never been a problem with that one. The other one, every other year or so, there's...
The first time we talked about this, wasn't part of the duplex being owner-occupied, or was that something different?
That idea was,
I'm arguing against changing to the duplex, where the duplex can go anywhere. I think a duplex should be restricted to the lot sizes, and if you're going to build a duplex, then call it a duplex. If you want to build accessory apartments, then they should be called accessory, because there's a huge distinction between them.
Oh, an accessory apartment is where
Everyone
The
requires
Owner
owner,
lives in the primary residence.
and I'm more in favor of allowing a two-bedroom accessory apartment than I am opening it up for duplexes. And it's not so much new duplexes, because I don't think there's that many land areas that are going to be available anyway. But what I would like to do, if we're going to build, and we want to emphasize building apartments, let's go back into the form-based zoning area and really create a lot of apartments and maybe some condos or whatever we could do there. So I'm just not a fan of changing the neighborhoods, and that's what I'm afraid will occur.
So what I'm wondering about is, what about, a lot of our housing in recent years has been created through the PUD process. And I understand that the ADUs are allowed to occur even in those neighborhoods because they're enabled by state statute. But what about two-family dwellings in a PUD?
well, I think what the Housing Subcommittee might be hoping for is that a developer who's looking at a project would see that they can put more units in, they can create more housing. And that's really what the Housing Committee wants to do, is they want to change the zoning so that it does result in more housing being created. The developer might be proposing a project that has a single-family component and a two-family component.
So you're thinking not so much that this would apply to existing PUDs that are all single-family housing at this point,
Well,
but
depending on the neighborhood, they may not be able to. I mean, some PUDs, some homeowners association may prevent that.
well, that's what I'm wondering. So homeowners associations can't preclude the accessory dwelling units
'Cause
because of the
Correct.
statute.
Correct.
But they could preclude the
The splitting into a duplex, that may
So-
be.
Right. So certain places that might be full of people who might want to adapt houses and turn them in from single family into duplexes would be prevented from doing that unless
If the
their
association
homeowner
prevents it.
association. But it's nothing, that would be the obstacle, not the PUD agreement that they were, because a PUD is kind of like a little mini zoning, set of rules just for that specific location, right?
Okay, so if your question is that, imagine a PUD that was approved with a bunch of single-family homes in it, and this zoning change allows someone to convert a single-family unit to a duplex, whether or not it's with conditional use, are you saying, will that require an amendment to the PUD?
That's what I'm wondering.
I don't think so. I mean,
Well, it would for lot area. If you had
Well,
open,
it's going to depend on, yeah, I mean.
usually they build out to the max when they build the PUD. So I would think
But like,
it
so
would,
Queenie Aska development going in, you know,
Could someone, my guess is that development going to have documents that will not allow someone to split into, you know.
no, but I mean, he couldn't, would this allow someone who's developing something like to create a bunch of duplexes instead
Well,
of single-family homes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there
as
are
part of their
duplexes in that
PUD plan.
project.
Yeah.
just
So-
because it's a PUD doesn't mean that you can't do an accessory apartment, I don't think.
No, that I understand, only because that's enabled by statute, so that would trump the homeowners association
For single-family homes.
rules on that, yes. But the duplex is another matter, and that was what I was wondering about. That could, the homeowners association rules for the subdivision that was created by a PUD could say, we don't care what zoning says, you're not allowed to do
Yeah.
this.
The way I see it playing out is that these new allowances, or if they were incorporated, new allowances for duplexes would have more impact going forward than making changes to an existing home in a PUD. Because what I think would be more likely to happen in the existing home and existing PUD is that by making the accessory apartment allowances more generous, people will just create accessory apartments.
Well, and I think the other thing is that, you know, there's lots of neighborhoods in town who had HOAs and they've kind of gone, so suddenly people might think, oh, well, this can't happen here, and it can. I mean, I think that's probably like your guys' neighborhood, Davis Park, right? Like, I mean, is that?
That had an association at early stages, and there isn't one now.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's sort of neighborhood association in terms of socializing and doing things,
Right.
but like if someone decided, yeah, I'm splitting all these houses up, it couldn't be
Well, if
stopped.
they're single-family homes, just because they have an HOA, that may not preclude them from being able to put an accessory unit in. Single-family home is the distinction.
But
It's not,
there's two different things here. The accessory apartment requires the homeowner to be living in the home to which the accessory
Correct.
apartment is attached.
right.
So, to your point that
my
more
point-
people could just do accessory apartments, that's different from somebody who currently owns a single-family home and says, you know what, I want to downsize, or I need to move or whatever, so I'm going to convert this into a duplex, move and rent out both sides and have a rental property.
That's why I think they should be accessories, because that's, in the accessory, I've got 5 different town rules here, and they're all very simple, they're all one page, and I'd like to distribute them, but some are more restrictive than others, some are much more better written than others, but I would prefer to see us go that route, where people who want to stay on their property but don't want to sell can do this.
So-
Can do a 1-bedroom or can do a 2-bedroom. And in the instance of Williston, again, where they allow 1,500 square feet, they allow, I don't know if it's Williston, there's another town, if you're over 5 acres, your restriction goes away. You can build up to 4,000 square feet for an accessory.
I'm just worried that
So
we're
there's all kinds of different ways, things that to consider. That-
So if the accessory apartment piece is expanded from 1 to 2 bedrooms, right, and it's from 30 to 50%,
Basically combining conditional use and making them permitted.
right, but if I can take my house and expand it by 50%,
Yeah.
call that an accessory apartment, it's also a duplex in the sense that it's kind of 2 even units, but the difference, just so I understand, the difference is basically I'm still living in the
You
whole
gotta live
piece
in
of
one
it.
or the other.
It can't be
Yeah.
rented. One of these even goes to the point of stating that it has to be a relative of the individual listed on the deed that lives in one of the units.
Yeah, I don't know that is,
That's in one of these.
right, but I don't know that would fly if challenged.
But so, we're talking two different things. So that is accessory apartments, and your position is you don't
But-
want to mess around with duplexes at all.
Well, I'm just
I
trying to
don't want to
understand.
change the density. I don't see the reason to change the density, other than
But I guess what I'm saying is
it's
this-
not so much that, it's, I'm afraid, the conversion of single-family homes into duplexes. That's why I would prefer to leave the density alone.
She really,
I don't care if
But
somebody
don't
builds a
you
duplex.
get what you want if you focus on this accessory piece?
So you
Because
live in-
someone can effectively split their house in half or build it half again, but it has to stay owner occupied.
If you live in a 1-acre zone.
But you're only limited to 2 bedrooms in the accessory.
You live on an acre and you have a half acre, you live on an acre and you're in a half-acre zone, you can build a duplex anyway now, just get a permit.
Well, you have to subdivide and.
You don't have to subdivide to build a duplex, do you?
Well, if you were, okay, so
To
maybe I
build a
misunderstood
two-family
what you
home.
were saying, but
To
if
build
you-
a two-family home.
okay, so if you meet the dimensional requirements, then someone could, yes, come in with a permit to create a duplex add-on if they
So
meet
you can
the
already do
requirements.
that in most of the houses in the falls. So there's no, I don't have a problem with people using the density that they have to use. And we downsized, when the reg was written in 2007, I've gone through this a couple of times, and they changed the rural district, and they added the steep slopes, and the idea was to emphasize the growth they reduced the zoning in all of this area.
This area meaning?
This area, meaning the village, the falls area, almost everywhere, except for my street, they increased it.
Reduced it, so in other words, they wanted to put it there, but then reduced the zoning.
They did reduce the zoning.
You mean
The whole
they-
point of the town changing the plan to do those changes was to make it more accessible to build
Right, but
smaller
by
lots.
reducing zoning,
So
they
they
made it
did,
less?
they did what they said they were going to do in the town plan. That's why when we were doing the plan, and I said, I don't know why we keep referring to this areas where we want to drive more development. Every time we write the plan, we do this, new planners will come in and say, oh, this is what the plan says we need to, so we're trying to increase an area that's already pretty well developed. And these are sustainable neighborhoods. They're not falling apart. They're, if anything, they're worth more than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You don't see any real estate signs all over these neighborhoods.
There were like 3 of them on Irish Hill this last summer, weren't there? Weren't there a few properties that were?
Oh, they're all in one development,
No.
all in that big development on the right side. They're all great big houses.
Well, all right.
Well, but not everybody wants to live in a single-family house. I mean,
Right.
that's increasingly, and not everybody can afford them. I mean, we're talking about increasing access to housing.
This is within the broader context that we have been and we addressed within the town plan, where we are looking at increasing density. We're looking at creative solutions to be able to do that. And this is a way to do that.
And I feel like the form-based neighborhood is where we should be functioning to do the majority of this. I don't think we should be looking at taking a neighborhood that is full of people who've lived there for 35, 40 years, and make them want to move.
Why would?
Because you
the
live
people
in a
around them are
neighborhood,
gonna
you
be
go out in your
dividing?
backyard and you sit in your picnic table and you're looking around, there's nothing. And then we change this reg and the guy next door says, I'm leaving, so I'm gonna build a duplex, I can make more money before I leave. And he builds a duplex and this guy is sitting here looking into somebody's window right there. He paid to live in a single-family neighborhood and we're gonna change it for him. That's how I'm looking at it.
Appreciate the position. Okay. So it sounds like we'll have more to discuss on this as well, because this is also, one of the things I was going to point out is this was for residential district. You were talking about Falls District, form-based zone would be in.
But residential is everywhere, isn't it, pretty much?
Well, no, there are,
Residential one, residential.
there are some little wrinkles, but basically, I've made comparable changes to the mixed-use district. All these districts that are here also have different changes like the ones that you've just looked at.
Yeah.
But they vary because of the things that were in the framework that the housing subcommittee.
So would it,
So the residential district is where most of the new housing is anticipated to go, just from a zoning standpoint. The village is built out, your area is built out. I mean, so that's what we're trying to be sort of
Well, the
forward
Falls area
thinking.
actually is not built out because of the zoning changes that were put in place a while ago, and that's why we're seeing development down there now. The other side of the bridge, there's 4 or 5 condos going in, and then Fisher's was developed. And that's all from zoning that was changed back in 2007. It's not anything that we've created recently. And there's a single-family home that went in just beyond Fisher's.
Right, I mean, there's some small opportunities for some infill that were created. But this is, my understanding is that Dean is talking about this as pertaining more to going forward with new development, presumably most of which would be PUDs, that could have more diverse housing types in them that might be more affordable to more people. And so the only places in town that we still have sufficient land really to do that are the rural areas and then the areas in the residential district that are not directly adjacent to the village. So, Quiniesca is a great example of that. So it's trying to, be more efficient and leverage the utility of those remaining lands and create an incentive to concentrate the development there so we can keep it out of the rural areas.
So, and there is a balance that we need to strike, because, I mean, you're right. I mean, the extreme is all single-family homeowners could say, all right, I'm going to turn this into a duplex, sell both of them, rent them out, and leave, which is an extreme.
Which changes the neighborhood. And it doesn't happen all at
Not to
once.
say
So I would
would,
say
right.
that this is a pretty massive change, for certainly, obviously in this room. But I think for most people, this would be kind of a big change. And this is a place where I think form-based standards could be incredibly useful to sort of show people like what could this look like? A lot of people are not used to living with duplexes. That's considered more of a sort of, I think in many people's minds, a sort of urban typology. And it so how would it fit in the context of Shelburne? I think some form-based standards could be very helpful about showing how that would sort of knit in.
Should we, it sounds to me like there's a little bit of impetus, particularly from the Housing Committee, to want to push some of these changes to help with density and that sort of thing. But I feel like we should probably address the form-based zoning discussion and see what might fall out of that within this context before we
I
consider
also feel like
pushing
this
changes.
discussion would be a lot healthier and more helpful if we had the people from the housing committee here to
I'd also like to see how
advocate,
the areas
you know.
are directed out, because I wasn't aware that it was not being treated as one, as one large growth area.
Can I just ask one thing that I'm not sure I'm completely clear on? The owner can occupy in the ADU examples either dwelling, right? Okay, that's what I wanted to be sure about.
So you could live in the small one and
Well, since we still have the form-based zoning discussion, and we definitely went over time, should we table this for now? See where form-based zoning goes? Definitely want to revisit this, and I think what the changes that you made to those other sections as well, I think potentially even seeing that within context could lead to other discussion points, maybe.
Yeah, I'm kind of eager to hear about the form-based zoning.
Yeah. So is there, so we have this, and we also, I think the comprehensive plan matters should be relatively short, and then we just need to talk about schedule. Those are the main things that we're gonna need to get through. So do we want to, I'm saying that in terms of, do we want to pare down this discussion a bit to be more overview kind of thing? Because I think initially we were looking at 25 minutes to,
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's what I have.
Dean, did you have
I
a
need to
chance
leave by
you were
9:30.
talking about maybe doing
Yeah, 15 minutes
making a
before
kind of table of all the,
I made
Oh,
some
okay.
of them, so those are
Thanks.
the 4 sets of summaries.
okay. So the way that this sort of went down, it was, I think, a very successful and enlightening session. And so the way that this transpired was I kind of gave an overview of what the form-based code is and how it emerged and what we would like it to be able to achieve, and then saying that the purpose of this was to kind of do a kind of industry check-in to see how realistic our regulations were and the framework for them. and our goals and aspirations for the corridor, how those lined up with market realities and things like that, and what we could be doing to enhance our chances of somebody actually wanting to use this zoning method. So we only had 75 minutes for this whole thing, so it was we had to use every second, you know. And then we broke into 4 breakout sessions, kind of focusing on a specific aspect related to development in the corridor. So the table that I was sort of heading focused on issues related to the built environment, the zoning, you know, the regulating plan, the kind of concept for the corridor, and how well aligned was that with market realities in Chittenden County, and also just were there some really interesting out-of-the-box ideas out there that we should know about, that they knew about, that maybe we could pursue, that kind of thing. And then Andrew, and with Susanna's help, kind of tackled the economic development and marketing aspect of the project. Dean focused on regulation and legal concerns, and then Ravi, who's our new zoning administrator, focused on the user-friendliness of the code and how it could be, you know, something that would be more user-friendly, more flexible document, and, you know, what's being done successfully in other types of situations. And so we got some great feedback, and should I just try and summarize what that was? Maybe can we all sort of talk really briefly? Or? Well, okay, so the big one that I got was that this idea of all these nodes of urban activity along the corridor it was probably a bit overly ambitious. And there were several reasons for that, one of which is that it just doesn't really, it's not supported by, you know, the real estate market right now. There was a lot of, the assumption would be that there would be stores, and then there would be maybe housing or offices above them. And that's just, you know, since 2016, when the code was approved, there have been tremendous changes in retail, I think, as everybody knows. And so it's just not realistic to think that we can really count on that degree of retail materializing. I mean, it's kind of not happening anywhere. So, so what the reaction that I had at my table was that the village is great, but there's this kind of undifferentiated sort of nothingness all the way up into, you know, quite a bit into South Burlington. And that it would be great to sort of break that up and maybe start with one center that could kind of allow people to cross over the two sides of the road, ideally to have some kind of an access to the lake, even if it was only visual, and that could kind of radiate out from there. It really advocating a more sort of organic approach. Also, that the urban frontages that were proposed in the plan may not be particularly realistic because they're very expensive to achieve. So. Okay, so that sounds kind of like they were saying, you know, ditch the whole thing and start anew. But it really wasn't quite that bleak. And I hope that the summary will explain some of that a little better. I'm just trying to sort of synthesize. But one of the really big opportunities in terms of sort of blue skies thinking that emerged was trying to sort of encourage thinking about the corridor as presenting many opportunities for kind of like undeveloping in a sense. Like we have a stormwater utility, and could this somehow be used to facilitate off-site stormwater use of properties redeveloped as for on-site stormwater mitigation? and but in a beautiful way as amenities. And the stormwater utility could make that worth somebody's property owner's worthwhile. They would be getting paid for their ecosystem function in some manner, to be determined. But this, if this were done in a way that turned these properties into amenities or places for recreation and scenic, attractive scenically, that in and of itself could actually help entice some of the development that we wish to see. So it's sort of thinking about it in a totally different way, a very exciting way, I think, that, you know, might also really help put a dent in our MS4 obligations that we're all facing in this town. So, you know, I don't know, Route 7 to the rescue for stormwater. But also it would present, you know, it would really go far to helping our problem of optics. You know, the poor visual impression that the corridor makes. And I mean, if you can kind of imagine some places, sort of blighted properties, repurposed for this, and perhaps, you know, public art is incorporated, and, you know, these could be places that would be sort of, might be fun to have, you know, a restaurant nearby, or even some housing and some of the deeper lots. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I'd say the things that echoed in my group that were similar to Kate's were, you know, well, all kind of interrelated, but, you know, that it's not very walkable, you know, especially trying to go across the corridor. It's, you know, complete street and all that, but it's horrible for that. You know, that the car traffic of itself is a huge issue, you know, that we've got to kind of figure out. But that there's also just been this historic hurdle of Shelburne being a really difficult place to develop in. And if we're changing that, if we're trying to, you know, why would we have two bits of code over the same area? Because what developers want is certainty. You know, so they gave this good example of Arlington, Virginia, you know, being successful mainly because there was huge demand, you know, and that the form-based areas gave them certainty, unlike the other process they're going through. But the issue we're facing is, you know, how are you going to generate that demand? You know, where is that demand going to come from? And there was a gentleman at my table, I'm blanking on his name now, but he was from down kind of Norwich, Woodstock, White River Junction. You know, there's some areas there that have sort of really come into their own and are pretty nice now. And they were like, how did you do this? And he jokingly called it a 40-year overnight success story. You know, that basically sort of opportunity was there all along, but demand finally caught up to it, and they were able to be successful. So it's not going to be super easy. So if there isn't organic demand, how do you create demand? You know, and so he was like, you've got to think about huge ways to incent people to want to be there. I think I had a note about, you know, whether it's tax abatements, block grants, VITA helping, all these different ways to kind of force that in. But yeah, and the other thing is they're like, where does Shelburne start? You know, that was just a little funny thing. And I was like, well, you know, there's this auto parts thing, and there's, you know, there's a sign right there you can see. But, you know, to them, that was a big thing, is like they would love to know that they've entered Shelburne and left South Burlington. And it's pretty vague. You know, you feel like you've hit Shelburne, maybe as you get a little closer down. But then the other echo, and I'll stop, is that my table also thought about, look, you've got to find a proof of concept. You know, is there public land in there so that you could potentially throw in public land to sort of incent the developer, saying, you know, we're going to give you a chunk of land basically for free, or lease it to you for $1 a year. You know, build something that would work, because I think once people see things that work, they're going to be like, oh yeah, this is cool, this is better. So what is that proof of concept? And they talked a little bit about, you know, with the rice lumber thing going on, that also being closer to the village, you know, is that a piece of property that you could somehow work with them on, or, you know, kind of the quirky motels that are all for sale along the frontage up there further. You know, is there some piece of property that could be like the showpiece, and then if you build it and show that it works, other people might be interested, especially if the developer was like, wow, that was easy. You know, I was able to get through that process without spending a ton of dough and not knowing if I was going to come out the other side.
Yeah, that's good feedback.
So single code and certainty of how to pass through that code that was the big thing. You know, because I think the other thing is that we don't really want to compete too badly with other neighbors, but if we become a place that it's just as easy to develop as whatever, well, maybe they would go to that corridor, you know, so instead of it being on some strip in Williston or one of the various South Burlington strips, like, well, you know, let's do it here. And they did say there's cachet in Shelburne. You guys have a cool brand, you know, so people do want to be kind of associated with Shelburne. So, like, what is that? What is the brand that you're,
So
it's-
how does this affect the redesign that we had started that we haven't got the result of yet? Is that significant?
I think it is, because we're probably trying to accomplish too much that may just not be realistic.
And just building on that.
Yeah, so I think, like, how could we scale things back? So one of the really interesting ideas I had in my group was, you know, set up a kind of a small group, Shelburne group of people with expertise and good ideas and kind of interest in this, who can, kind of like the housing committee, you know, a sort of ad hoc group that can start to come up with ideas and just advise on, you know, what's realistic. I mean, you know, I'm thinking, somebody from Redstone, it's a major commercial property owner in town, could be on it. You know, like what would sort of float your boat, you know, that we could propose here, you know, that would get you excited, and get that. You know, we've sought that kind of feedback, but in only very limited ways, you know, like how could we do it on a more regular basis, you know, so that, people feel that this is something that the town, the town's got some skin in the game on this. You know, what would that look like? What would be compelling? And I think, you know, the Shelburne Business and Professional Association, I mean, those guys might be willing to really kind of take a leadership role in some of this, you know, the Rotary.
Hiring Perry.
Oh, Hiram Perry, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
I don't know.
Perry, but just,
Just as our economic
Yeah.
development guru for Shelburne.
yes,
you know,
wouldn't he be
like,
perfect?
Right.
Yeah.
He can be on his, while he's walking his babies and his dogs, he can have his earpiece in and be
And just get,
doing deals.
whip this thing into shape, yeah.
But you know,
So-
that was clear that there needs to be someone who leads this, whether it's something that Lee could take on as part of town manager. I mean, who in the town is focused on economic development? It doesn't really exist today, whether that was a person or a committee. I mean, there's so many super brilliant, smart, entrepreneurial people in town. You know, I think you could tap a handful
know,
of people. I think of Tim Williams with
Yeah.
all his little restaurant empire, and he's
Yeah.
got his Exteris business, he's got all, you know, like,
What would Fresh Tracks make of this? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
there's just something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but we're going to have to make this happen. We're going to have to. Right now, the place looks sort of abandoned and like nobody cares about it. And you know, a determination to. We're going to have to show that the town wants to reclaim this area and sort of reinvest in it. And that can happen in some small ways. And I think the public art thing could be a really great way that would be so well aligned with our brand. I mean, we have the museum here and
farm.
the farm
Craft
and
school.
the craft school, the teddy bear factory, but the iconic, you know, giant bear. You know, there's a lot of different ways that, you know, you could go with this. And
Should we incorporate this into, I mean, I feel like we should just have a dedicated meeting to just start getting into form-based zoning, because we need, I mean, there's the changes that Brandy made, there's this feedback we want to incorporate, there might be some streamlining we want to do based on this. Is there I mean, obviously we want this sooner than later, but we've got some things coming up, we've got a bit of a gap depending on what feedback we get on the plan.
You want to segue to schedule?
Yeah, we could certainly do that, unless you had something to add on that.
Well, I would touch on it if you want to spend time, or do you want to go? I mean,
Most- Well, if these have been distributed, people can read notes. I'm
Yep.
more worried we're going to lose people in
Yeah.
10 minutes.
I just have one comment.
Sure.
Very quickly. It's like, it seems to me that there is gray infrastructure that's happening in that corridor, but there might be some synergies with green infrastructure development that could be funded through stormwater utility or some kind of stormwater fees. So I see that there is an opportunity there in terms of converting that gray infrastructure into some kind of like a green infrastructure using the resources that we have and leveraging those, which in turn can trigger other kinds of attractors like cultural revitalization or businesses that can come after. So I think like we can think about in terms of like what are the leverage points that we can have.
Sure.
So I
the
see that
idea
the
of
green
building a
infrastructure
node,
as a
yeah.
way to. It seems to me like that came out as part of the. It's really big in the form-based
Yeah.
zoning and.
I think the new
And that
leader
gets
of
what
Sorry,
Shelburne
I know
Farms,
you wanted to wrap it up, but I just
that
wanted
wasn't
to.
for you, sorry.
the new leader of
No, you're good.
Shelburne Farms, Kate, should probably go on that list. She had a really good article on, I don't know where I read it, just a couple days ago.
Oh, right, it's
Yeah.
Robin Tourneau is the new,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, and I was
in
thinking
the
along with the
fragrance.
green infrastructure things that Asim was talking about, you know, this could be an interesting way to sort of harness some energy generation stuff too. I mean, that could kind of go hand in hand. And I mean, one of the things that's nice about the corridor is, you know, you don't have to worry too much about noise because it's a very noisy place right now. So that could be a place to do some of those micro wind things. You know, I don't know where, you know, what all that is about really, but it would be an interesting thing to kind of combine with this as a way to start to show we're taking ownership of this area. The municipality is that is, but also as a way to start to create that identity that indicates you have moved into a new place. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's
You've gone upscale.
you've gone upscale.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I look forward to getting into that.
Well,
yeah.
and the other thing I have to throw out is that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a lot of people, multiple people at the table going like, why are you guys so in form-based code? Why do people think this is the panacea? Who really thinks that form-based code is the solution? And they were all really skeptical of form-based code. And there were two other towns there, Williston and Colchester,
Colchester.
who have some areas utilizing form-based code, and they've seen zero or minimal return on that. I didn't push on whether it was an option like in ours, but so take that for what it is. But there are a lot of people kind of like, whoopee-doo, you're doing form-based code. Why do you think that's going to fix anything? Really, there was serious skepticism.
I think, yeah, fundamentally, it's make it easy.
Yeah.
Or make it approachable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing that really resonated with me was, why do you have both? Because if you want a form-based thing, if you want to change the look of that quarter and you have the other code, you're going to have development happening under both directions, and you're going to have this misfit, mismatch thing. So if you want it, you got to go with it, and you got to make it predictable.
Yeah.
And I was like, that seems logical.
It does make sense.
We did argue for that, but it didn't fly
No, I
3 years ago. And-
Right. I try to explain, you know, I have this vague understanding of how it came to be, what the battles were, but I said, talk to Kate, talk to Kate, talk to Kate.
Well, we'll put some focus on that then in some future meetings. And so then, is there anything in depth on the comprehensive plan aside from that it is moving forward?
I do want to just emphasize one point. First, I believe I sent out an email to the group to explain that the select board had adopted a motion and set the dates for both public hearings. Did that go out? Okay. And I think that it's important for people to understand what that really means. The first hearing is not as quick as it could have been. It's proposed for the 22nd, and it could have been held as early as the 8th as a practical matter. So that does, on one hand, mean that the select board members have more time to prepare, but it tightens things up on the second half to get the hearing in. So what
And this
I
is
would.
January you're talking about?
January 22nd
Yeah.
is the date of the first hearing. And
Yeah.
so, and then the second hearing is the 12th. We're lucky in that the select board normally meets the second and fourth. We're lucky that in 2019, there are actually 5 Tuesdays. So if the select board has its first hearing on the 22nd, they actually have until, which is a Tuesday, they actually have until the following Sunday to get a notice for the hearing and get a new version out. and it wouldn't really change the schedule. So my pitch is that if you talk to a select board member, encourage them to ask questions, and maybe this would get formalized if the chair wants to, propose to meet with them, so that if they go into the meeting on the 22nd with a set of suggestions, it's going to be okay to propose changes. It's just that we'll want to know what those changes are and be able to get a document out on the street, so to speak, by the 27th, so that the second hearing can continue as it was planned on the 12th. The planning commission needs to get a notice, you get a chance to comment on it, but the significance is, get their comments to us, let us know in advance so that we can start to respond to them and possibly have a revised version ready so that there's no delay.
So you're saying we should meet on the 24th?
Well, the planning commission's meeting will be on the 24th, so you will have an opportunity to react, and that's a good thing. I didn't highlight that, but that's true. There will be an opportunity for you to react to whatever comes about on the 22nd. So that's really the main point having to do with the plan. The second hearing would be the 12th. If they make changes then they're not gonna make the deadline, but that's not the end of the world. That's all about the plan.
And then, well, so it's good that it's still moving, and I'll draft a note and run it by you and send it out. So then, as far as the meeting calendar, how's everybody looking? Are we gonna have any quorum issues? Based
When's
on,
the schedule? What it-
December 13,
it was the last page.
27. Oh, wait,
Yeah.
December 27th?
That's a big question.
That would certainly be a
That
question.
probably
Highly
won't,
questionable.
probably won't work for
That's
me.
probably not going to work for me
I won't
either.
be here.
I was assuming that would probably happen, so
Yeah.
yeah. So we'll just do I know in years past we've bumped it forward. I know that there's stuff on the schedule and we may end up having to do some shuffling around the plan. So is there a pressing reason to try and bump it up? Because the 20th would be difficult too, I would imagine.
To keep moving on things? I mean.
Well, yeah, in terms of maintaining 2 meetings in December, or do we just say that we'll do 1 since we did 2 in November?
If they're
There
not
could be
gonna
good
deal with
reasons
the
for it
plan.
having to do with the zoning, but you won't have anything to work on with the plan.
And that's, yeah, the plan we wouldn't, so it'd be more anything really pressing with zoning, and we'd at least have the 13th, but if that's warning a hearing, that wouldn't be heard until early January anyway, right?
So if you are meeting the 13th, you wouldn't be able to have a hearing until, the first meeting in January, the 10th. So, yeah,
Right, so
there's
the
really not much to
27th
be
wouldn't
gained.
be a critical date. And it doesn't sound like there would need to be, like, do an exception to have a meeting another night or something. Like, my main concern was the plan. The zoning issues obviously are important, but I don't think that,
Traditionally, we don't do 2 in December.
I thought that was November.
No, I don't think so. Don't
You
we
know,
usually?
we've worked really hard on getting this plan out. I think we can take one.
Oh, that's totally, well, last year,
One
we
meeting.
didn't have any meetings in December, so.
Yeah, I think we can
Dean and I were here.
do that.
Yeah, that's fine. So, all right, so we'll just axe the 27th, keep the 13th, and then January 10th and 24th?
Yeah, I'll be here.
This plan sounds good. I can make 13th. I'm going to UN meeting in Poland.
Okay.
So just,
Which day? Which day?
I'm taking off on 13th. I can't do it,
13th you can't
but
be.
that's fine.
Right, okay. So everybody else okay on the 13th? So
Well, I'm going to the same, so.
Katowice.
rolling with you on now? Well, if anything needs to be thought through, just please get back to us. Otherwise, I would assume that we'll all be here on the 13th, the 10th, and the 24th, unless otherwise noted. And the big concern, and the main reason that I'm saying this is because literally last year there was a week where Dean and I sat here and nobody showed up, and we thought there was going to be a quorum. And then I know we had to cancel some other meetings, so I just want to get ahead of it.
I think we did have a couple meetings. where we had discussions.
Oh, right, but without a quorum, right. That did happen once, that's true. So, all right, if we're good with that, were there any other announcements? Then if not.
Do you want us to keep updating that
Calendar?
shared Google Doc? You have I was trying to call it up here because I've been trying to update it as we went along.
I think, yeah, when Dean and I met, I pulled it up and
For some reason it won't
We
open
talked
for me.
about putting it as a kind of an agenda item every meeting where we would talk about availability.
yeah, I think we'll start getting into that habit. I think for now, as long as we know we're gonna have a quorum on these dates, and to just to please be proactive and let us know ahead of time if there's gonna be an issue, that would be great, and then we can just incorporate
The
that
next
as a
agenda,
practice.
we should have a review the schedule
And we'll
just to
pull
make
it
sure.
up and people can add or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can send the new version. I just filled in till December, but didn't fill it after that.
Yeah, I think that one only went through January anyway, or something. But, yeah, so I'll take a motion then to adjourn.
So moved?
Second?
Moved by Kate, seconded by Dick. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Sorry, I heard him first.
I've just been wondering, whatever happened?